All right, so we did start Exodus a couple of weeks ago, but we didn't actually open the book of Exodus. Um, and so I'm hopeful that we're going to get to that this morning. Um, and, frankly, I'm just going to say that I've really been praying that the reality and the magic of the Exodus narrative would come alive for you guys through this study, if that's not already the case. All right. So, this is the same God that's at work today, accomplishing the same purpose that he was working on in this story that we're talking about. And he uses the same means to accomplish his goals. So, we come to little meetings like this, and we're all in very different places. Sometimes we're struggling with things, and sometimes we're a bit more confident. Um, and the only place that there is to find real strength that endures is inside the realities that this story describes. So we should be transformed by our understanding of this narrative. Okay, so this is actually pretty exciting, at least it is for me. And so we're going to get into Exodus chapter 2 this morning. I'm not going to read long stretches of the narrative. I'm going to assume that you know the general layout of the story. I am going to summarize and then make some comments, and then we'll dig into any areas of theology that come up as they relate to who God is and sort of what it means to be God's guy. The setting, I know it says Exodus chapter 2 up there, that's because that's what we're studying, but the setting for our introduction to Moses is chapter 1. It's where he says that there's like a new Pharaoh that does not know Joseph, and the Israelites are basically subjected to slavery at that point. And because the Hebrews are so numerous, and because there's this new and weak regime that's threatened by that, the how many Hebrews there are, they basically initiate an extermination campaign against any Jewish boys that are born. All right, so that's their solution for a way that they can control this slave population. And so it is a little bit interesting to reflect on the fact that 430 years earlier, Egypt had been God's provision for his people. All right. And so, just like all of God's provisions, over time they become possessions. And possessions will inevitably make us their prisoners. And so, here the children of Israel sit imprisoned by what was originally the provision of God. Okay, so that's our setting. And on the back end of what we're going to go through today in chapter 2, verses 23 through 25, God makes a pretty important statement. And so I got a little hint for you. Anytime that the clouds part and the voice of God is heard from on high, listen to what he says. Okay, because that's going to be the main point. If you're supposed to take away anything from a passage in Scripture, it's what God says when the clouds open up and he starts talking. So in this passage there, God speaks and he says, "Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them." So we're supposed to understand then that we're dealing with a God that remembers his covenant with Abraham. That's Genesis 12. And he sees that his people are in misery, and now it's like he kind of pushes the unpause button. I know there's not an unpause button, okay? It's a pause button, but he unpauses it. And now God is prepared to act. And how is it that God acts? Okay, that's our question right there. And so that context is what we use to look at chapters 2, verse through 10. And then it's in those verses that Moses is preserved by a difficult decision that his parents make. All right? They act in courage and in faith by putting this 3-month-old baby into a basket and sending him downriver. All right, so in Hebrews 11, there's an interesting commentary on this passage. The author of Hebrews puts it like this in verse 23. It says, "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." That's kind of interesting. The capacity of Moses to become the person that he would be is rooted in parents whose faith in God was so vital that they didn't fear the edict of the Egyptian king. Okay, so we'll talk about fear a little bit more later in this series, because fear's a pretty major theme in the development of Moses. But do any of you have any fear in your life? Right? People are too afraid to say yes. All right. If one person were to admit it, then more would also. There we go. We have an admission. So, right? God's going to say to Moses later that all men should be fearful. Okay? But the question is, who do you fear? So when God reveals himself to Moses, Moses was afraid. And that's a good thing. You're supposed to be afraid when God shows up. But the parents of Moses did not fear the Egyptians. They feared God. And that allowed them to make a courageous and difficult decision. Okay, and so then we jump forward in time a little bit, because that's the way that the narrative goes. It just does. Moses comes into his adulthood in chapter 2, verse 11, and that is where we're going to pick up. It says, now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up, that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that, and when he saw there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other. And he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you a prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." All right. And so, who's Moses? Okay, and I would suggest that Moses is a failed revolutionary. All right, Acts 7 is a speech that Stephen gives, and we're going to be looking at some places in the Bible that don't really seem to be connected with Exodus, but these passages comment on the Exodus, and it's in looking at their commentary that we can get a deeper understanding of what's really going on here. Okay, so the way that the New Testament interprets the events in the Old Testament is our primary authority on how we should interpret these events. Okay, so in Acts 7:22, Stephen says, "Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. But when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel." And so it's like he woke up one day and he looks at himself and he realizes that he's not an Egyptian. I'm a Hebrew. Okay, and when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. All right, so very, very early in the narrative of Moses, in fact, before he meets God at the burning bush in chapter 3, it's already in the mind of Moses that God has raised him up for this purpose, to be the deliverer of the people of Israel. All right, but Moses' first foray into liberating people doesn't go very well. Not only did he become the evil that he's trying to liberate people from by becoming a murderer, he's not even recognized as a deliverer by, he clearly perceives himself to be a deliverer, but he's not recognized that way by the people that he's trying to save. Okay, so Moses flees to the wilderness, where Moses lives the next 40 years of his life in total obscurity, in quiet desperation, in the very prime of his life. Okay, this is the time that Moses should be the most useful. And yet he spends his day with sheep. And the narrative ends this part with it's like a note of despondency, as Moses has married Zipporah and they have a son, and Moses names him Gershom, which means a stranger there. And so I think it's very interesting that 40 years of the life that we know of Moses is spent with him doing nothing, being nothing, believing that he has failed at the thing that he most wanted to do. And he feels alone, right? He feels that he's a stranger in the place where he is. And so imagine the confusion and the hopelessness and the isolation and the futility that Moses lived with daily. Okay? God's work is far from being accomplished. The vision that Moses had for life and the reality that has taken place could not be any more distantly removed from one another. So have you ever felt anything like that? Right? I think that I have. And I think that maybe you have. Okay? And I think that if you haven't, then you will. And I think that there's a really important theological reflection here. All right, there are actually three things that we're going to draw out of this narrative. The first one is about the sovereignty of God. Okay, so from the very earliest days of Moses' life, God was in the mix. God was providing for Moses. Okay, God provided through godly parents who made a very courageous choice to release their son into the care of God. All right, they didn't know what would happen to Moses, but they did know that God loved Moses as much as they did. So how's that for something to chew on about like a biblical notion of parenting? All right, and so then God set Moses up to be raised in the finest household in all the world. He was educated as Egyptian royalty. All right, and he was a man of influence and power. Amosa is a pharaoh of this same general time period, and his name is quite possibly translated from the Egyptian as brother of Moses. Okay, so Moses is a significant guy. He's a man that's known and that has position. And God used the pagan education that Moses received, all right? So when you read the law of Moses from Exodus 20 all the way through Leviticus, the format of the law bears remarkable resemblance to the other legal codes that existed at the time, okay, especially the Hittite codes, which would have been known to a man like Moses, but completely unknown to the average Hebrew. Okay, God redeemed his past. God used the learning that Moses had received because God is a sovereign Lord. All right, God was at work long before Moses knew it. And in just the same way, God has been at work in your life long before you knew it. Okay, God is sovereign over where you live and the time of your life, all right, the time that you're placed. according to Acts 17, anyway. God's sovereign over the personality that you received, the skills and gifts that you possess. There's nothing about you that's unknown to God, and there is nothing about you that's not useful for God, for his purposes. Okay, Moses' time in Pharaoh's household was not wasted time. And we're going to see in a minute that his time in the desert with sheep was not wasted either. All right, even in Moses' despair, the wilderness was a provision from God, informing him and shaping him to be the man that God intended for him to be. Okay, so we need to be able to cultivate a healthy sense of the sovereignty of God. And on the authority of 1 Corinthians 12, the people that God has caused us to partner with are no accident. God composed the body how? Just as he wills. Okay, so who is God's provision for my life? It's the people that I'm linked with right now. Your spouse, your friend, your disciple, your mentor, your coworker. All right, that's God's provision. God is sovereign over people and places and times and calling and gifting. And I think that's an important thing to come to terms with. Okay, because just as God is sovereign over history and his will has been and will be purposed, when he has a will for you or me, he will accomplish that purpose. Okay, there is no part of your life and experience that God is unaware of and unable to redeem and unable to make useful for his purposes. So all of your failures, all of your successes, God will use to fashion you for a future that you are being called to, so that you'll be useful in a way that no one else will. And I really think that's important for us to think about. Okay, a lot of us have learned to resent our past. And, there are things that need to be repented from, or, at least to not take pride in. But at the end of the day, we need to realize that the past is what it is. Okay, and God's calling on my life includes my history, and it includes my past. Okay, God is able to redeem all things. So our second point this morning that we're pulling out of this is that in the early parts of this narrative, we see an angry young leader in Moses. Okay, he became the evil that he was resisting, and he became a murderer. And James is pretty clear when it says that the anger of man does not accomplish the righteousness of God. At the same time, there's something very profound that's going on in Moses at that stage of the game, all right? And that is that he is identifying with his people. Okay, and it's simply not possible for us to lead or influence people without radically and authentically identifying with the people that God has called us to interact with. Okay, and so you've all seen guys holding cardboard signs by the side of the road. All right, and most of us try to pretend that they aren't there. Or we give them a little something to ease our own conscience. But have you ever seen somebody treat them badly? Or say degrading things to that guy with the cardboard sign? And so if you have, you've probably had an entire range of responses, right? From wishing that people would be nicer, all the way to maybe agreeing and cheering them on. But what would your reaction be if the person holding the sign was your dad or your daughter? Now, how would you react as someone belittled a a person that you love. Okay, you might just be fighting mad. And this is the reaction of Moses. All right? Rage and anger because he identified closely with these people. He's not calloused. He's not able to tell himself that this is just the way that it is. He's furious because his brother is being unjustly beaten. All right? We breathe the air of indifference, and we wonder why we don't make a difference. Okay? Moses identified with these people. And God is calling on us to identify with the people that he has sent us to with the message of redemption. All right, so I don't know how you feel about it, but I find working with people in this culture extremely difficult. All right, to watch as good men, all right, men with real capacity and ability are just completely sucked in and made totally ineffective by the world system. All right, a system that seeks to use them and give them a superficial identity with only like essentially trivial significance, and it rewards them with fleeting pleasures at the expense of the call of God on their life. All right, and I think that this is our proper concern. All right, this is what should keep us awake at night with worry, if anything should. This should pain and anger us. And are we able to identify with the people in the world and identify with what this world does to real people that are dignified and made in the image of God? All right, you cannot effectively lead or influence without that. Okay, you may manage, you may tinker, but you're not really going to change anything. Okay, so there's a great article that everybody should read. I've read this out loud in this setting maybe a dozen times. All right, it's David Wells. It's called Prayer, Rebelling Against the Status Quo. I'm going to read a paragraph or two from it. It says, "What then is the nature of petitionary prayer? It is, in essence, rebellion. Rebellion against the world in its fallenness, the absolute and undying refusal to accept as normal what is pervasively abnormal. It is, in this, its negative aspect, the refusal of every agenda, every scheme, every interpretation that is at odds with the norm as originally established by God. Or, to put it the other way around, to come to an acceptance of life as it is, to accept it on its own terms, which means acknowledging the inevitability of the way it works, is to surrender a Christian view of God. To pray declares that God and his world are at cross purposes. To sleep or faint or lose heart is to act as if they are not." Why then do we not pray as consistently as we talk? All right, and I think that the answer is because we don't believe that it'll make any difference. All right, we accept the situation as unchangeable. All right, we accept that the church isn't going to grow and lost people are going to stay lost. It's just the way it is. All right. Does any of that resonate with anyone? All right, might have a little bit of truth to it. He goes on. All right. "Against all of this, it must be asserted that petitionary prayer only flourishes where there is a twofold belief. First, that God's name is hallowed too irregularly. His kingdom has come too little, and his will is done too infrequently. Second, that God himself can change this situation. Petitionary prayer, therefore, is the expression of the hope that life, as we meet it, on the one hand, can be otherwise, and on the other hand, that it ought to be otherwise. It is therefore impossible to seek to live in God's world on His terms, doing His work in a way that is consistent with who He is, without engaging in regular prayer. Any of that convicting for you? It is for me. All right, the gods of the Egyptians were greater than the people of Israel. But God had a will for those people, just as He does today. And as God once told Paul, there are many people of mine in this city. Okay? And this really requires a heart for the fight. Okay, this requires an identification with how lost people are. And that identification enables us to see through the smoke and the mirrors that they put up for us. Things are great, man. How are you? Okay, we know that the Spirit is working in their life just as He is in yours. And in order to have the tenacity and the boldness and the endurance to fight this epic battle with the gods of American culture requires a level of identification with people that draws us to anger. Okay, not anger at them, but anger at a system that enslaves people that have great dignity and turns them into cogs in a machine. All right, and Moses had that. Moses identified with these people, and Moses was angry. All right, and I think that the church could work on that some. I think that we need a more keen eye to see the score with people for what it really is. Okay, we are here to liberate lost people from spiritual darkness. And that requires energy, and it requires focus, and it requires a deep commitment, as Wells said, to prayer, and that from God's point of view, things can and should be otherwise. God has placed you in the gap. Okay, so chew on that for a little bit if you can handle it. Okay, but it's not really enough to stay in that place where you're angry. Okay, we need to be in touch with some anger. We need to see things for what they are. And we need to know that we're in a battle. We need to be committed to fighting, and we need to know what's at stake. Okay, we need to be able to not make peace with the lie that is this world. But that's not enough. All right, so God takes Moses from that place, and He sends him to the wilderness to learn the lessons that only sheep can teach. Right? In order to lead God's people, Moses had to learn to be a shepherd, not just a revolutionary. The metaphor of shepherding it's the prominent metaphor for leadership in the Bible. All right, both in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. So God is referred to as Israel's shepherd numerous times in the Old Testament, and He calls upon Moses also to be a shepherd to Israel. And it's fairly interesting to me that in reading through Exodus 19 and beyond, that the hard edge of the revolutionary spirit of Moses remained. Okay? But there was a softening of his heart. This man that had been so full of rage and cause, okay, that are so obvious here in the middle of chapter 2, right? These things haven't vanished, but they've been tempered by a deep and sacrificial love for the people that God called upon him to lead. Okay, in chapter 32, 9 through 14, God's basically just totally exasperated with these disobedient people. Okay, and he proposes to Moses that just like he did with Noah, he could just wipe these people out and start over with just Moses. And the old Moses might have been okay with that. All right. But this new Moses interceded for those lost, confused, sinful, disobedient people. Okay, he pled for God's mercy for them. And these people have essentially given Moses the bird over and over again. These people have been a huge difficulty to lead. Okay, these people weren't joyful to lead. Read the narrative, right? It's like, are you kidding me? At every single turn, they want to go back to Egypt. They want new leadership. All this stuff they're complaining about. But through all that, Moses loved them. Okay, there is a certain softening of the heart of Moses. It's like a remarkable and beautiful transformation. And it is possible that this is the kind of transformation that God is seeking to work out in our lives as well. Turning us into shepherds. Turning us into people like the great shepherd of John chapter 10, who's prepared to lay down his life for the sheep. Who, like the great shepherd, knows his sheep by name. And the sheep hear his voice, and where there's a vital and real connection between the one who leads and the one who's being led. Okay, there's a relational intimacy and trust that's established through the behavior of the shepherd on behalf of the sheep. Okay, the great shepherd seeks the lost. He leaves the 99 to go after the one that's lost. Okay. How many good losses are there to God? We are to pursue. All right. We do not always win, but we always pursue because we love people. All right. We're to be the shepherd. Peter tells us in 1 Peter 2:15 that Jesus is the shepherd and the guardian of the soul. And we're called as human shepherds to be the instrument which the souls of those that he shepherds are to be cared for. All right, so that's a fairly contrasting image to that of the revolutionary. All right, it's poignant though, and it's powerful because it's not the anger of man that accomplishes the justice of God, right? It's the love of God that brings men to repentance. Right, so what is our job? Well, we model the shepherd-like love of God for his people. 1 Peter 5:2 says to shepherd the flock among you. And Paul says the same thing in Acts 20:28. Okay, which means that we do not lead or influence from some control tower, all right, from some ivory tower of privileged enlightenment, but that we're on the ground with the sheep. We are among them. Because it's really only through relational connection that we can convey any kind of real spiritual leadership or, pull on anyone else's life. Okay, it is not enough to get your doctrine right. It's not enough to get your morality right. It's the ability to convey deep things that have occurred in our own hearts to other people. Okay, using words, but also by them seeing how we process things and how we engage life. Okay, you really can't teach that with words. It's something that you have to do life with people in order for them to get. You have to experience life together. They have to see how you trust God, which means that you have to be open, and we have to be able to reveal the brokenness of our hearts and people need to be able to see that they can identify with us. And our lives teach them what it looks like to pursue Jesus Christ with our lives. Okay, we shepherd through relational connections. That's the only way that you have ever been moved. All right? And it is the only way that you will ever move anybody else. And so for 40 years, Moses gave himself to these sheep, and he got exactly nothing in return. Right? He accomplished essentially nothing. But Moses was changed. All right? And in what you may be perceiving as the futility of your work, right here and now, is it possible that God is teaching you lessons that only sheep can teach? To love the unlovely, to be vulnerable to coarse people, to pursue the blind and fleeting and foolish spirits around you, because God loves them. All right, so in the opening chapter of the narrative of the life of Moses, there's this call to twin values that are very much in tension with one another. All right, there's this warrior that's prepared to go into battle and fight to win, and the shepherd, with all of his sensitivity and sacrifice, that's prepared to move towards the weak and lay down his life for the sheep. And it's my thought that maybe we should meditate on these things a little bit and interact with them some. And, you know, together we could begin to cultivate a deeper biblical understanding of who God is and what kind of people God has called us to be. All right, so that's basically my thoughts on this chapter.